Hello everyone and welcome back to our Chapter 18 Lecture number 1 mini-series here. This lecture was broken into two parts. It's really overall a big introduction to the endocrine system, but we're moving into the second part here, which is going to be an overview of all the endocrine organs and kind of a summary of what their big picture function overall is. And then what we're going to do is we're going to diverge from our Pearson's Fundamentals of Anatomy book, and we're going to go right into the pancreas first. I wanted to start with an organ that I think many of us are at least somewhat familiar with. Diabetes is a pretty prevalent disease out there. I'm sure many of you might already know what insulin does and have at least heard of that. And so we're going to start by looking at an organ that I think some people are familiar with, and then from there we'll get into kind of the harder organs where the book, they jump right into the hypothalamus, which is the master endocrine organ, which makes sense to start there. But I wanted to at least introduce you to some of the organs and some of the functionality that is kind of on the simpler side. So that's going to be our approach to it. And as you can see on this one, I highlighted the part that's being covered. So this is definitely the second part. Obviously, the first part, if you wanted to know kind of what was covered to keep you up to speed, it was really just an introduction to the endocrine system where the different cell-to-cell communications was being described, and then we kind of broke down classifying hormones, but now we're moving into like what are the big picture functions of these endocrine organs, and then really looking into a deeper dive into the pancreas here. So that's what we're going to be moving along into here. As usual, I always start my lectures with objectives. I really don't like going over them since you can obviously read, so feel free to pause this here if you want to see what we're covering in part 2. Like I said, it's really just big picture stuff of the endocrine organs here. Alright, but let's go ahead and get started here overviewing the organs. This was that first picture, and this really should make a lot more sense as we progress into the semester. So as we get into this unit, you're going to want to revisit this figure and see if things make sense here. All right, but a lot of this is the big picture functions, and so we're going to be zooming in and getting really specific with the functionality as we continue in the semester here. So let's get started on kind of the big picture ones and the big picture organs, and we're going to start with the master endocrine organ. And so the hypothalamus, you can see, is the master endocrine gland. A lot of instructors would call it that, no doubt about it, because what it does is it's one of the glands that is going to receive a lot of the sensory input, whether it's direct or indirect, and then it's going to control a lot of organs, as we're going to see. Now, it's going to be indirect control, because typically the hypothalamus, as we're going to see, is going to control the anterior pituitary, and then the anterior pituitary leads to other organ systems having functions. And the reason we have these multiple steps, just like I was talking about a chemical cascade having multiple steps, the more steps we have, the more control that our body can elicit at various levels and varying degrees. And so hypothalamus really doesn't do any specific main function right off the bat by like causing like the body to do something right off immediately. What it does is it communicates with the pituitary gland, and then often the pituitary gland communicates with other organs. We're going to see this later. So for now, just really understand, if I said it was the master endocrine gland, you would know hypothalamus. So this one's a little bit hard to get into without fully seeing its function. So let's move on. Just understand hypothalamus really communicates with the pituitary gland, and as you can see, the pituitary gland is second in command, or you can almost think of it as the vice president. And really, it's going to receive messages from the hypothalamus. This is me kind of shorthanding hypothalamus here. So it's going to receive a lot of hormones from the hypothalamus, and then that's going to send out information for slightly more direct control. So again, these organs are super important. They have a lot of kind of big picture control, but it's not direct control, as we're going to see. Again, both of these will be revisited. This is why I'm going to start with the pancreas, because these two hormones themselves are quite complex. I'd rather start with somewhere where it's a little simpler to kind of understand functionality. So don't get too caught up on them. Master endocrine gland, great. Knowing that this is second in command, great. All right. Then that takes us to the thyroid gland. This one, the thing that I stress with my students most is it regulates normal metabolism. And the reason I have normal completely capitalized is it's important to understand that we're going to be dealing with various hormones that kind of enhance metabolism, and examples I've already brought up was adrenaline, which is epinephrine, and norepinephrine. Okay, so those both represent adrenaline. Those are going to be emergency metabolism. Okay, and so they basically amplify the effect of thyroid hormone and basically increase your heart rate dramatically, get everything going. We know what adrenaline is. Okay, so this one you should definitely know regulates normal metabolism. So these are all big picture functions, as I continue to stress. When we get later in the lecture, we're going to really elaborate on these three. For now, master endocrine gland for hypothalamus is great. For now, pituitary gland, knowing it's second in command and it receives messages from the hypothalamus, perfect. And for now, thyroid gland regulating normal metabolism and being important for development, especially in children. Like as children start to develop, like learning to walk and learning to talk, that's all development, growth. That's the thyroid gland. All right, but these are the kind of, the next set of organs, these are a little bit more direct with their functionality here. And so again, if you forgot, my color code is per slide, because now we're going to move on to the next one. If you forgot this -1 and kind of in these brackets here, or parentheses here, those are going to be, this represents the figure number right there. All right. But the next set of organs, these are going to be kind of, we're moving just kind of in order here. And we're going to get to the adrenal gland. And what we're really going to do is break it into the two parts. Notice there's a medulla and there's a cortex. And I think these are a little bit more direct with kind of simplifying what their function is, because they're not eliciting control over many other organs. This is controlling the pituitary. The pituitary, as we're going to see, controls a lot of these other organs. This is the effectors. Now, these are actually carrying out specific responses, so I think it's, for students, a bit easier to wrap your head around. And so we're going to just start with the adrenal medulla, and notice this is the emergency metabolism, all right, via adrenaline. And again, adrenaline is epinephrine, norepinephrine. So when I say anything about emergency metabolic activity or emergency metabolism, that's hands down the adrenal medulla, because you need to be thinking of those catecholamines. Notice I used a term from the last lecture, which is catecholamine, which is a tyrosine derivative, which is an amino acid derived hormone. It's a tyrosine derivative, and I know that this is water soluble. So all those things I just mentioned, water soluble, catecholamine, tyrosine derivative, those are things you really need to get to memory here. All right, but for now, adrenal medulla, the function, the big picture, if I was to ask what's the big picture function of the adrenal medulla, it's for emergency metabolism via adrenaline. All right, the adrenal cortex, this is going to be salt balances we're going to learn. And if you look kind of down here, the salt balance is aldosterone. So we're going to learn sodium balance and potassium balance. Really comes from aldosterone. And those, of course, sodium and potassium. We have the sodium-potassium pump, right? We know that these are really an important one. So that's the salt balance that we're talking about. And then it does have cortisol or corticosterone or cortisone. I usually stick with the words cortisol and cortisone for this, but that's going to be the stress metabolic response, which you want to keep your cortisol levels low, but we do need that sort of stress response. Like when you wake up, it's a pretty stressful environment. So we do utilize cortisone throughout the day, but we want to keep those levels kind of low, even though they do help us with, your basic level stress. All right, so this one's a little bit tougher. This one, you kind of need to know specific details for me to easily test on the big picture here. But hands down, the pancreas, which is the next one, this is blood glucose regulation. I expect students to know that that's the function of the pancreas. This is a must know. Same with adrenal medulla. Those two are really easy for me to test on straight up. So the pancreas regulates the blood glucose levels. And it's kind of hard to understand when we get into this, but we deal with kind of hormones that get secreted at high concentrations when there's a dramatic change, and then we have hormones that kind of keep balance or keep things at level. The pancreas secretes insulin, as we're going to learn. Insulin gets secreted after a meal, and of course that means glucose levels skyrocket. So insulin needs to be balanced, insulin needs to be secreted at a high level. And then of course we go into a state of fasting, and once we reach that fasting level, we just need to maintain blood glucose. Well, that's when something called glucagon takes over. So it really, both hormones regulate the amount of glucose in the blood. So this is the big picture of the pancreas. Pineal gland, you should know, is sleep cycle regulation. It secretes tryptophan, and again, sorry, I said tryptophan. It secretes melatonin, which is a tryptophan derivative, right? It's, again, still water soluble, but tryptophan derivative hormone is going to be melatonin, which is secreted by the pineal gland. Parathyroid hormone, you'll see, is blood calcium regulation. There actually also is a thyroid hormone that contributes to blood calcium, which we're going to get into more details later. The heart, the hormone it secretes helps reduce blood pressure. And then kidneys are going to produce red blood cells and contribute to calcium regulation. So this overall is the big picture of all these organs that we're talking about. And so notice kind of keeping things in a range here. All right, blood calcium, keeping blood calcium levels in a range. Keeping our ability to exchange oxygen, i.e. red blood cells, at bay. So this is all maintenance long-term, keeping things within reasonable ranges, I guess, and is really maintenance of consistency. All right, so we're going to get into, and we're really going to just start with the pancreas. I think the pancreas is a bit easier for students to really understand. So we're going to start there. All right, so you're going to hear me often say you need to be able to describe things anatomically or anatomical descriptions. And so that's what you're going to see here. Hands down, you need to be able to find this on a model and know that this is the pancreas. It doesn't matter any of the models that are in my lab classroom, you need to be able to recognize is straight up the pancreas. And I would say that that's pretty safe to say, and a safe assumption if you're not in my class but you're taking a different anatomy and physiology course, you need to be able to recognize the pancreas. That's all there is to it. All right, but as far as anatomical descriptions, you should know that it sits inferior to the stomach. It is technically superior to the small intestine, and if you notice, it's technically medial to the duodenum or duodenum. So the duodenum is this little region right here of the small intestine. And so often a question that gets posed, and since this is early, we often as instructors like to pose, is this endocrine or exocrine, to kind of know, do students have any understanding of one, what does endocrine mean, what's exocrine? Obviously, we're in the endocrine system, so why on earth would I bring up exocrine by any meaning? And the reason I would do this is because the pancreas, of course, is one of the main organs that produces digestive enzymes, so it functions as both. It's both endocrine and exocrine. So when it comes to the exocrine side, you should know that that's called the pancreatic acini, and that's this darker pink region. And I'm going to bring up histology. So to be clear, we're going to be doing a lot of histology. That's going to be the lab portion of the lab exam. So when I mention lab exam content, I really am going to be talking about histology related things and some models. Obviously, like I said, you should know that that's the pancreas, so I have it. And I'll point out the sort of things you can expect on lab exams for me to ask. But hands down, knowing the darker pink regions are going to be known as the pancreatic acini, and knowing that that represents the exocrine regions is really important. And it should make sense that most of this tissue is going to be exocrine, because hands down, we're going to need large concentrations of digestive juices in comparison to low amounts of hormones. All right, but as far as the endocrine cells go, those endocrine portions of this organ, or the endocrine tissue of this organ, is known as the pancreatic islets. It's also known as the islets of Langerhans, just in case you take a standardized exam and they don't switch it to this. But this is definitely the pancreatic islets, and that's going to be a lighter pink region. Again, we'll get to the histology. This is a bit zoomed in, and I really don't think this is the right sort of image here. You'll see these little islands being these small pink little islands, which I'm going to show you a little bit later. All right, but the hormones that these endocrine cells, or the pancreatic islets, these regions are going to contain insulin secreting cells and glucagon secreting cells. These are the cells that I focus on. Some of you might take another course. There is a third sort of ingredient secreted by the pancreas. I don't cover it. I stick to insulin and glucagon here, and because these are the pancreatic hormones you need to really know. And we're going to break those down in just a little bit. But for now, understand that the main functions of the pancreas is to aid in digestion via enzymes. That's the pancreatic acini region, and that's probably what you should do. You should probably bold this in green. All right, and then, but its main function related to the endocrine system is to regulate blood glucose levels, and it does so through the secretion of both insulin and glucagon. It's insulin, pretty much insulin primarily after meals and during meals, and then glucagon as we're fasting, in a state of fasting. All right, so many hours after consuming a meal, you would expect glucagon to maintain our blood glucose. All right, but if we're going to break down these pancreatic islets, again, we're talking about islets of Langerhans, again, just so you know in case you take a standardized exam. But what did I say the two hormones were? I just literally covered this, and at this point, you really need to be trying to get that to memory what it is. And so the main hormones that it produces, of course, is insulin and glucagon. Now, this is the part you need to really understand. So right now, pancreatic islets is a tissue within the pancreas that secretes hormones. The two hormones are insulin and glucagon. Now you should ask, what do insulin and glucagon do? All right, fortunately, both of these are going to be a peptide hormone, but insulin is a peptide hormone that's produced by specifically beta cells. And you need to know this. I hands down expect you to know that the pancreatic islet consists of two main cell types. Beta cells, and it's going to be alpha cells, are the ones that secrete glucagon. But beta cells secrete insulin, which helps lower blood glucose levels. Okay, and notice it's secreted primarily during and kind of after meals. I should say shortly after meals. Certainly, it can be secreted slightly before meals, but that's if it gets secreted before meals and then you don't eat, it stops being secreted. So it's primarily during and shortly after meals, because then once we get into a fasting state really late after meals, that's going to be glucagon. In fact, I'm going to add the word shortly to this because it's important. All right, so shortly after meals, it's target cells. So with any hormones, you're going to want to know what type of hormone is it. Well, it's a peptide hormone, which means it's water soluble, right? Instantly, I know it's water soluble. I know it acts as a primary message, which we really haven't stressed those details. But again, I'm kind of just bringing that up so you get familiar with it, because later on it's going to be important. All right, beta cells are the cells that secrete it, and its function is to lower blood glucose. Now, what it does is it targets. You should always know the cells that get targeted. It's primarily going to be liver and skeletal muscle, because, of course, we have skeletal muscle everywhere. And so notice the function truly to the way that blood glucose levels get reduced is this insulin actually stimulates the target cells to increase the glucose and amino acid uptake, i.e., it stimulates cells to remove glucose from the blood, to remove amino acids from the blood, and then start utilizing them and even producing ATP from them. So that's the function of insulin, which is why we, as I said, we tend to think of hormones as causing maintenance or maintaining a range. Well, insulin is what's going to help when our body gets really out of the range. Insulin is going to help bring it back to the range. And what I mean by this is, the only way we're going to have a huge spike in our blood glucose is through consumption. And that huge spike has to be basically taken care of immediately, and that's what insulin does, is it stimulates all of our cells to uptake amino acids and glucose, start utilizing, and then start producing ATP. So really know the target cells of being the liver. That's one of the main areas that stores glycogen, and the skeletal muscle. And if you notice, I'm going to bring that up, notice stimulates glycogen, protein, and triglyceride formations. Well, these are the main molecules that our bodies and our cells produce for long term. So glycogen is our long-term glucose store. Proteins is our long forms of amino acids. So we collect a bunch of amino acids to build proteins. We really don't store proteins. We build them to use them. And then triglycerides is the main form of fat that often gets stored in adipose. All right, but if we were really to break this down, you kind of got some really simple main points here. That's what MPS stands for on my slide. Again, you can see that this was figure 18.16, so we kind of jumped around in this chapter and moved quite a few sections up. But the major point to understand from this is the pancreas has the beta cells found in the pancreatic islet region, and that those beta cells secrete insulin when blood glucose rises. And so blood glucose, of course, is going to rise during and after meals primarily. And then what the function of insulin is to reduce those blood glucose levels by stimulating cells to convert them to energy reserves that get stored within the liver and skeletal muscle. That's ultimately what we're talking about when we talk about insulin here. So, of course, we're going to have to now move on from insulin to glucagon, but really have this understanding that insulin gets released when our blood glucose spikes, which means we just consumed a meal and really have high levels of glucose in the bloodstream. Okay? So when we move on to glucagon, and this figure does an amazing cell. Again, Pearson's figures are really spectacular here. Figure 18.17. It might be a little bit different. I believe this is actually the older edition, but I liked it, and so I kept it on here. But notice, here's your normal blood glucose range. So this is what our body is supposed to keep it in. And what happens is we have insulin. And so as we saw here, insulin levels, and to be clear, notice insulin, we have increasing blood glucose levels, then we have beta cells secrete insulin, and here's the functions right there. And this really summarizes everything you need to know right there in the one figure. Just make sure you understand that this is a negative feedback loop. That's how most hormones are secreted, in a negative feedback loop. So as soon as blood glucose levels start to decrease, the amount of insulin that gets released next time would also decrease. So we would release as much insulin at the beginning And then as blood glucose starts to drop, as we're getting closer and closer to the range, the amount of insulin that's released would slow down. Okay, but we're moving on to glucagon here. When we talk about glucagon, its function is to mobilize those energy reserves to really help maintain blood glucose levels during fasting. And by fasting, I simply mean, hey, you consumed a meal and you had quite a bit of time to digest it. Now you're in a state of fasting, which is, somewhere between the state of 4 to 8 hours roughly. All right, but notice this is secreted by cells of the pancreatic islets, but these cells are specifically the alpha cells, which therefore this is completely, when we think of glucagon, it is completely insulin's antagonist, meaning it's doing the exact opposite. And we saw, antagonists with muscles, where if a muscle was a flexor, we had the antagonist being an extensor. Insulin and glucagon are kind of that same combination. Insulin helps cells store blood glucose, where glucagon is going to help those cells break those blood glucose that's stored. It's going to help break down those storage forms. The target still remains the same, so you don't have anything unique here. We're still going to target the liver. We're still going to target skeletal muscle, so that itself does not change at all either. But again, previously the goal was to stimulate glucose uptake and then form glycogen, stimulate amino acid uptake and store proteins. Well, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to break down glycogen into glucose, and then we're going to break down those triglycerides, and we're going to learn this later, that triglycerides get broken down into glycerol and 3 fatty acid chains. You don't need to know that for now, but basically that's how we release energy, and we get energy from triglycerides, or mainly the fatty acids in there. All right, and then overall, if we were going to use proteins to form glucose, we can do that through a process called gluconeogenesis. This is an early introduction to this term. We're going to get into a metabolic chapter after we discuss digestion, which is unit 3, so we're quite a ways away. But you should be familiar with this term gluconeogenesis. It's not glucogenesis, so the neo part says kind of like a unique way of forming glucose, and that's doing things where we don't have carbohydrates as a precursor. So literally, you can avoid eating glucose, but your body still can form glucose by either using triglycerides or proteins. And so overall, those last 2 slides of information there about insulin and glucagon, alpha cells, beta cells, really summarizes everything you need to know about the pancreas. I think the pancreas is a really direct organ on what do you have to know. There's no gray area. It helps monitor blood glucose. And like I said, on the extreme end, when blood glucose levels spike up because you consume a meal, insulin is going to take over to get your cells to start utilizing and storing glucose in the form of glycogen. And then, of course, glucagon does the opposite, helps maintain blood glucose when you're fasting and you really don't have as much blood glucose in. But to kind of finish this off, we do have to have the lab section here. And so this is the lab section. I like this a lot better than the images of Pearson. Pearson always has great images, and they kind of just zoomed into one of these areas right here. And I don't think that's the best approach, because this is going to be the islets, and then on the outside it's going to be the pancreatic acinar regions. All right, so when you look at an image like this, what I would expect, any of these images are fine. I don't have to specifically use any one of these 3 on an exam. That's what the classroom's for. You should be spending time looking at these under the microscope and making sure you're able to kind of identify where these islands are. But what I'm going to use on an exam is images just like this or fairly similar to it. I just usually use Google, Bing, or I actually take pictures of the microscope images that I find. Now, if you look at this, what you should be able to note is anywhere where we have the lighter pink colors, you need to know that that represents the pancreatic islets, okay? And that means that that's the endocrine side of things that contains alpha and beta cells, and that it secretes insulin and glucagon. All of those concepts are fair game for me to ask about. So literally, you can see this one image on an exam, and I can ask, what is this an image of? And you would say the pancreas. I can circle this region and ask, what's this lighter pink region within the circle? Well, that would be the pancreatic islets. I can say, name a hormone based on the histology slide you're looking at. Well, insulin would be a hormone, glucagon, either one would be fine. I can also say, name the darker pink region. So maybe I just put a circle here. What's this dark pink region within the circle? That would be, of course, the pancreatic acinar. And then you would need to know that that secretes digestive enzymes or is the exocrine function. So this histology, there's quite a bit I can ask. I don't just identify this histology image. I ask that. I ask the little regions. I ask name the hormones. So you really need to have a great grasp on the actual organ and on the pancreas itself here. And you really wouldn't be fully understanding the importance of the pancreas if we didn't get into, when problems arise. That's usually the best way to know the function of an organ, is to really know, hey, here's an issue and what sort of effects does that issue have. And so, of course, diabetes tends to be the common the common disease that's often associated with the pancreas, especially insulin secretions here. All right. And so diabetes is characterized by high blood glucose levels. That's what BGLs are, if you haven't figured that out yet. High blood glucose levels due to faulty glucose metabolism. So here, the faulty formation of glucose, the faulty processing, the faulty uptake, it really doesn't matter. Any sort of faulty glucose metabolism can be considered diabetes or signs of diabetes. So just really high blood glucose levels. All right. Often one of the key indicators is often something called glucoseuria. So if I mention this term, you got the word urea in the end, so you should know that that's referring to urine. You have the prefix glucose, so it's really straightforward that it's saying, hey, there's glucose in the urine. I.e., if your urine ever smells like syrup, that's usually an initial indicator that you might have problems with glucose in your urine, so glucoseuria. It doesn't necessarily instantly mean diabetes, but if that became somewhat consistent, where you're constantly smelling your urine being syrupy, that would be time to go to the doctor. Typically, your urine is going to tell you a lot, just like your feces, and generally speaking, bodily fluids tend to tell a lot about health, because we all know, every day you're going to the bathroom, so you kind of know the consistency of all of your movements. Well, if something's abnormal that's coming out of you, that's not usually a good sign. And so syrupy smell would be one of those. And so in this case, the reason that happens is blood glucose levels are so high that it overwhelms the kidney, and the kidney fails to reabsorb all of those glucose. And that's, you're going to learn about the kidney, but the kidney basically pushes everything out and then reabsorbs it. All right, but overall, there's two types of diabetes. There's type 1 and type 2. And really what I stress for students to know is one of the major points, which is which one's insulin dependent versus which one is insulin resistant. Notice resistant versus insulin dependent. All right, but insulin dependent tells you everything. It tells you that the individual is completely dependent on getting insulin injections. So when you say insulin dependent, that tells you the person cannot produce insulin. And usually what that means is either the beta cells failed to actually to form, or what's most likely case is it's likely genetic and likely an autoimmune disease. So technically diabetes tends to be an autoimmune disease where the beta cells get attacked. So notice we're linking a concept, we're linking beta cells, we're linking insulin secretion. So you need to make that a jump to say, hey, type 1 insulin dependent means problem with beta cells, and therefore since no insulin is being secreted, the body it's not stimulating the cells to absorb that glucose and form your long-term energy store of glycogen. All right, so definitely note this, but really the key word to know, and again, this is why I would argue that a lot of these things that I talk about are concepts. Type 1 insulin dependent should be enough. If you can get that to memory, you should say, all right, insulin dependent. That means somebody needs insulin injections. Why would they need insulin injections? Oh, the pancreas is failing to produce insulin, which means the beta cells are failing. Therefore, that this is likely autoimmune. That's the jump and kind of the sequence you should be going through. Now, type 2 is the most common. There is normal insulin production, but the receptor levels are either low or do not respond. And so we say that in this case, type 2 is insulin resistant. The person produces insulin, but the body is not responding, so it's resistant to the produced insulin. Often genetic, okay, but it's often associated with obesity or diet related, and it can be treated via medications, exercise, and dieting overall. We're going to talk a little bit about something called upregulation and downregulation later on, but we've been talking about how hormones function right now, but understand that the cells themselves can also respond, can manage their response by increasing or decreasing the number of receptors. Well, with a poor diet that has, sugars constantly in the bloodstream and basically insulin being high, and the cell's not really responding to that high insulin, over time the body does something called downregulation, where it reduces the number of receptors. And so that's usually what's associated with type 2, and then medicines make those receptors more sensitive, or stimulate the cells to produce more of those receptors. All right, but again, still likely genetic related, i.e., if there's a history of diabetes, there is some genetic link, but hands down, this is definitely genetic, where this likely has some genetic links, but, if you maintain a really poor diet, very likely you can end up getting diabetes. All right, I would encourage you to review these figures. Again, figure 18.18. It's a really great figure talking about why all these areas get targeted. But really, the way to think of this is your blood turns to a slush. Think about, sugar water. And if you let sugar water sit long enough, it becomes really, really sticky, i.e. think of syrup. Imagine your blood turning to like a syrup and having to move through the body. And so with that, the reason these areas get damaged is because there's more pressure in the blood, because it's thicker, it's more syrupy, and that causes pressure, and that pressure actually hits on neurons and can actually start causing damage. So notice kidney degeneration, because you're literally pushing out too many sugars and are overworking the kidney at the time. Retinal damage. One of the early signs is if your vision all of a sudden corrects, which your vision will not get better without taking corrective measures like wearing some sort of glasses, contacts, or something like LASIK surgery. All right, early heart attack. Again, you're moving syrup through your system instead of fluids. Peripheral nerve damage. This is the area where blood pressure is the lowest. So now you have a slushy blood that's now moving against gravity and trying to work its way back to the heart. So these are all kind of common issues, but again, if your vision corrects and you have sort of a syrupy smell in your urine, it's highly likely that it's going to be something related to like diabetes. In fact, my wife's uncle said one day he woke up and he was amazed. He didn't need his readers. He thought it was so great. He went to the doctor like a couple weeks later and was like, "Hey doc, you'll never believe this. My vision's corrected." And he's like, "Ooh." He's like, "That's not a good sign." He's like, "Really? Why not? I thought it'd be great. I don't have to wear glasses anymore." Well, that's the sign of diabetes, and sure enough, he had to start taking medicines to help with diabetes. Your vision just isn't going to correct itself. It's a misshapen eye, and that's really what's causing that kind of imbalance or inability to see. But we're not talking, obviously, the eye. So, but overall, this gets us through the first lecture. So this is the basic group note review. You should be able to answer the first three. So those of you that didn't see the first lecture, this is what was covered in full details. And then these are the new ones. So you should be able to answer 4, 5, 6, and 7 at this point. So we are officially through one lecture. This is the second episode, or part 2 of lecture 1 here. I hope things are making sense, sort of my layout, but this is pretty much exactly how things are going to go. I shoot for lectures to be right around 30 minutes. Some will be a little bit shorter, but endocrine, this first unit with the endocrine and the lymphatics and immunity, it's going to be hard to get under 30 minutes, but for the most part, this is kind of the area we're heading. So I hope starting with something like the pancreas and starting with the functions of insulin and glucagon kind of give you a good introductory overview of what hormones are supposed to do and what they can do. Now, we're going to see a wide range of functions. To me, this was one of the basic functions. So work through the pancreas. It's a good one for me to start giving you, quizzing you on and asking questions about, because I think it gives a good general overview and is kind of one of the simpler hormones to gain an understanding. But you really need to break the pancreas down, talking alpha, beta cells, knowing which cell secretes insulin, which cell secretes glucagon, and really understanding what those hormones are. So both were peptide hormones. If you didn't know that, I didn't stress it too well with glucagon, but both were peptide hormones, and I'll be stressing that throughout the future lectures as well. All right, but thank you all for listening. Look out for the second lecture. When we move into the second lecture, we are going to start with the master endocrine gland, which is the hypothalamus. And then as we go through that lecture, I think I broke it into 3 parts. We're going to break down the pituitary gland, and we're going to break down histology. So we're starting to build in some lab concepts with histology. Right now, the only lab concept histology-related thing you have really is the pancreas right now. All right, but thank you all for listening. I will see you back at the second lecture or the third episode. Take care, everyone.